Grid warp is a transform which allows you to distort an image using a grid of points. The grid warp operator can be added as a separate layer or as an operator within the stack. To add it as a separate layer, select it from the Insert menu. It will be in the Transform section if your Insert menu is displayed as groups. The grid consists of a rectangular set of control points, which will be evenly spaced across the whole image. If I click and drag on a point, you will see that it moves that part of the image below the control point. If I move it further, you'll notice that although the distortion is mainly within the 4 rectangles around the control point, the lines passing through the adjacent points are kept smooth, so the image is also distorted a little in the next rectangles. This is because each control point has a set of handles, which are automatically being adjusted to keep the warping effect smooth. If I turn off the Auto Handles button, you can see the handles for the selected point. I can now drag on the ends of the handles to manually adjust the warping effect. I'll just turn on the Hide Overlays on Edit button so you can see the effect more clearly. This will hide the grid while I'm making a change, but as soon as I let go of the mouse, the grid reappears. You can move more than one point at once by control-clicking to select multiple points. You can also select a range of points by clicking and dragging a box around them with the mouse. You can reset the position of the selected points by clicking on the Reset Selection button, or reset the selection of all the points in the grid by clicking on the Reset All button. If you try to drag one of the edge points inside the grid, you will notice that the edge of the frame is dragged inwards, revealing a copy of the original image below. This means that the edge control points can only be dragged outwards, or along the edges, as there are physically no pixels beyond the edge of the image frame. Also, if you try to drag a point beyond the edge of its rectangle, the pixels will be dragged over the top of pixels in the adjacent rectangle. This can produce some interesting effects, but it's probably not very useful. The position of all the control points in the grid and their handles can be keyframed. This is actually a still image, but I can add a little bit of motion to the sea, for example, by keyframing the grid warp over time. First, I'll set the points for the initial warp. And then I'll set this as a keyframe by clicking on the Grid Motion Set Key button here. This has added a keyframe for all the points and enabled the auto keyframing mode. So when I move to a new position in the timeline and adjust the points, a new keyframe is automatically created. I can now add more keyframes or copy and paste the ones I've got to continue the animation. So now I've added a bit of motion to the still image. Let me turn off the overlays in the cursor's view so you can see the warping effect more clearly. If you want to reduce the amount of warping, you can drag the warp amount slider to the left. Okay, maybe it's not that realistic, but with a few more keyframes you could probably make something which might work as a background for a composite image, for example. Now I'll show you another way to animate the grid warp. If I click between the control points, all the points are deselected, and you can see a blue rectangle with a single control point in the middle. This is the transform rectangle which contains the grid warp. I can adjust the transform rectangle by clicking and dragging on its corners. I can also drag on its edges or its center handle. As I move it around, you'll see that it acts as a kind of distortion lens over the image. So let me show you how you can use this as a different way to create an animated distortion effect. First, I'm going to remove this grid warp layer and then add it as an operator in an inside-outside layer, so I can restrict the effect using a matte. I'll right-click on the base grade in the Inside Operators column and change the operator type to Grid Warp. Once again, you'll see the grid warp appear over the image. Now I only want the warp to affect the sea, so I'll create a matte over the sea area using a rectangle shape. If I toggle the matte overlay on and off, you can see the area which will be affected. Now I also want to move the boat a little within the warp effect, so I'll also add a softened ellipse to the matte to include the area where the boat is. I'm going to use a finer grid this time, so I'll set the default grid resolution under the Customize button to 7 columns by 14 rows. If I now reset the grid warp operator by right-clicking on it and selecting Reset Operator Entry, you can see we now have a finer grid. I'll move the points again to create a wave effect by selecting rows of points and then dragging them with the mouse. I can select multiple groups of points by holding down Control, or Command if you're on a Mac, and then clicking while I drag a box around them. I'll move a few of them individually too. I'll also drag the edge points out a little to make sure that none of them are inside the image area. Now I'm going to set this as a keyframe at the start of the sequence. I'll jump to the end of the sequence, and now I'll select the transform rectangle by clicking between the grid points. In order to create the animation, I'm going to drag the ending position of the transform rectangle downwards. I want the interpolation to be linear so the transform moves at a constant rate. And again, you can vary the amount of the warp by adjusting the warp amount slider. Well, that looks a little bit more realistic. I'll now add another warp layer to move the clouds. So that's one example of how to use the grid warp transform in Baselight. It looks fairly realistic. However, the waves move the same amount in the foreground as they do in the distance, which isn't quite right. So I'm going to modify this grid warp to use a perspective plane. I'll return to the first keyframe of the animated grid warp and remove the animation by setting the grid motion keyframing mode to constant. I'm now going to add a perspective plane by enabling the perspective plane button below the transform section here. If I now zoom the image out a little and enable the new sequential pick button, I can define a perspective plane in the image. The transform rectangle, and therefore the grid warp, are now sitting within this perspective plane. I can make adjustments to the perspective by dragging on the green handles of the plane. Now that I've defined the perspective, I'll turn off the perspective plane overlay so I can edit the position and size of the grid warp. I'll stretch it forward and then reposition the front edge with the bottom of the frame, as this will be the starting point for the animation. Now I'll add a linear keyframe here, and then move ahead to the last frame of the shot. I'll slide the grid warp down to its ending position, and a new keyframe is automatically created. Now, if I zoom back out again and hit play, we can check what the effect looks like. Again, I'll turn off the cursor overlays so you can see the effect more clearly. Okay, that looks more realistic, with the waves in the distance moving a smaller amount than the ones nearer the front. So that's one example of how the grid warp can be used to modify the appearance of an image in Baselight. In this case, the grid warp transform is affecting the whole image frame. However, in many cases, you'll only want to manipulate a small part of an image. In fashion magazines, it's very common for faces to be digitally manipulated in order to change the way they look. This next example shows a situation where a client has asked if it would be possible to make the face of the woman on the right slightly thinner. We can use the grid warp operator in Baselight to do this. As I only want to affect the area around the woman's face, I'll set the grid to just cover that area. I can do that by dragging out a new transform rectangle. First, I enable the Set New Transform Rectangle button. Then I can drag across the area on the image. I'll zoom in on the image so I can adjust the grid more easily. Now, the way the grid warp works is actually by applying two grids to the image, a source grid and a destination grid. When you first add a new grid, the destination grid points lie on top of the source grid points, so the image is not warped initially. When you move a destination point, pixels around that point in the source grid are warped to the position of the corresponding control point in the destination grid. In the previous example, I used a rectangular grid which covered the whole image. As there were no specific features in the image I wanted to warp accurately, I just used the default positions of the points in the grid. However, in this case, I want to precisely warp points around the woman's face. So I'm going to start off by setting the positions of the points in the source grid so they lie on specific features. You can view the source grid by clicking on the Source button here. Notice that the source grid is shown in orange. Now I'm going to start off by selecting the transform rectangle by clicking between the grid points. I can now scale and rotate the rectangle to cover the area I want to warp. Now I'll drag the source control points to line up with specific features on the face. If you find that there are gaps in the grid where there's a feature you want to warp, you can add extra points by holding down the Windows key or the Control key on a Mac and then clicking where you want to add the extra point. Notice that a whole line is added, either vertically or horizontally, or both, depending on where you click. If you end up with too many lines in the grid, you can remove them by holding down Shift and Windows, or Control on a Mac, and clicking on the line. In general, it's best to use a grid with as few points as you need, and not to put them too close together. Okay, that looks about right for the position of the points in the source grid. So now I'll switch back to the destination grid by clicking on the Destination button. The grid is now blue again, showing that we are working with the destination grid. This is the one that the image pixels will be warped to. You'll notice that initially the destination points line up with the source points, so the image is not currently being warped at all. This is because the Sync Destination Grid to Source button is enabled in the source grid page. If you don't have this button enabled, a warping will be applied as soon as you switch back to the destination grid, which may not be what you want. So as requested by the client, I'll now make this woman's face look a little narrower. I'll turn on the Hide Overlays on Edit button again, so I can see what I'm doing more clearly. Okay, that looks about right. I'll turn off the overlays in the cursor view again and check the warping effect by toggling the bypass on and off for this layer. Even though I made a relatively small adjustment, it's made quite a difference to the image. Now, unlike the previous example, this is a moving image, so I'll need to track the motion in order to make sure that the warp stays fixed to the woman's face. I can add a track to the grid warp transform by using the tracking controls here. I'll use the area tracker to track the woman's face as she moves. I'll reposition the tracking target and then hit Track Forwards. Okay, the track's complete, so I'll return to the grid warp strip by clicking on this button, and we can see the result. Again, I'll hide the overlay so you can see the effect more clearly. Well, I think that looks okay. I don't need to make any manual adjustments, but if I did, I can easily do that by enabling the grid motion keyframing and then adding manual keyframes to the tracked motion. As you can see from these two examples, Grid Warp provides you with a powerful tool which enables you to quickly apply minor fixes to an image, but you can also use it to add more elaborate effects if necessary.